Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in to the Business Talk podcast. I am Deepak, your host on this journey. I am delighted to welcome Professor T.T. Ram Mohan, former Professor of Finance and Economics at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Over the course of his career, Professor T.T. Ram Mohan has served on several committees, including those of the RBI, and has been associated with the boards of several companies. Professor T.T. Ramohan holds a PhD from the NYU Stern School of Business, New York University, and is the author of 7 books. In addition to having published numerous research papers, he has presented his work at various international conferences. A prolific columnist, he has written extensively for leading publications such as the Economic Times, Business Standard, The Hindu, The Times of India, Indian Express, Financial Express, The Asian, The Wall Street Journal, The Wire, and Quartz. In this episode, Professor T.T. Ramohan shares valuable insights from his book, Privatization in India, Challenging Economic Orthodoxy, and his broader writings on privatization. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor T.T. Ramohan to the podcast. Professor T.T. Ramohan, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Well, thank you, Deepak, for having me on this show. It's a pleasure to be on Business Talk.
Thank you. Professor, your book takes on a widely held belief that privatization inherently leads to greater efficiency. What motivated you to challenge this economic orthodoxy in the Indian context?
Yes, it would not be correct to say that I'm the first to challenge the orthodoxy on privatization. There's a very substantial literature on privatization in various parts of the world. And that literature has compared the performance of public and private enterprises. And we have a number of studies which show that private enterprises don't always outperform public enterprises. There are also studies comparing pre and post privatization performance of various enterprises. What happened before privatization, what happened after privatization. There also, we have a number of studies that show that privatization did not necessarily result in the improvement in performance of state-owned enterprises. Now, in India, when I wrote this book, the process of economic liberalization had been underway for about a decade. And so I thought it would be, and one of the components of the liberalization process, as you know, was privatization. Various enterprises had been privatized to various degrees. And I thought it'd be useful to take stock of the results. What has happened? Is there any improvement in performance that we are seeing? And what are the implications of the privatization that has happened so far for future policy? So I thought those questions were worth exploring. And one of the things which really struck me, which also stimulated me to embark on my research, is that in India, unlike in many other places, we had very fairly developed capital markets at the time of economic liberalization. In other parts of the world where privatization is being undertaken, particularly in the erstwhile communist countries, whether Russia or Eastern Europe, capital markets had been relatively underdeveloped. So I thought it is worth examining whether it's possible to subject state enterprises to the discipline of capital markets instead of transferring the ownership wholesale. So that is, again, one of the interesting questions. So these were some of the motivations for writing up this book.
Professor, you argue that private sector firms do not consistently outperform public sector enterprises. Could you share some specific sectors or case studies where this has been evident?
Well, there's a very substantial literature which is outlined in my book, and it would take up too much time for me to go into various studies which have done that. But let me cite just one study, which is on British privatization. This book was written in 1997 by Martin and Parker, two well-known academics. And British privatization has served as the inspiration for privatization worldwide. And they examined the performance of 11 leading British enterprises which are privatized, such as British Airways, British Gas, and so on. And they come to the very interesting conclusion that there is no evidence of comprehensive improvement in performance post-privatization in what is regarded as a model of privatization. So in Britain, we didn't see that kind of improvement. And as some of your listeners may be aware, there is now an attempt underway, that process is already underway under the present government in Britain, to re-nationalize British Rail, which had been privatized. So the opposite process is happening. But you see, instead of looking at case studies, on what has happened consequent to privatization, I think it's more useful to focus on the reasons why enterprises have performed better consequent to privatization, to see whether the critical factor is change in ownership or some other factor. Now, let me give you a number of other reasons why performance improves consequent to privatization. Typically, state-owned enterprises are subject to various fiscal constraints. There's not enough money with the government to fund public enterprises for modernization, for expansion, for growth, etc. And so the performance of state-owned enterprises suffers because government is fiscally constrained and it's not able to infuse capital. After the enterprises are privatized, the private owners bring in capital. And with the infusion of capital, the performance improves. So what has happened is that there was no capital, there's now capital. And there's nothing about, there's nothing to do with managerial dynamism or innovation or whatever. The key factor is just the infusion of capital. Secondly, state-owned enterprises are typically subject to a large amount of restructuring ahead of privatization to make them attractive to private bidders. After the new owners come in, the results of the restructuring show up, and people say, oh, ownership has brought about a change in improvement. No, it was the restructuring which happened under government ownership. Even if they had not been privatized, you would have seen the improvement in performance. Thirdly, there are a lot of price constraints to which state-owned enterprises are subject. Government is very reluctant to increase prices because there will be a general adverse reaction from the public. But after the ownership changes and it goes into private hands, the price constraints are removed. Very often, privatization is part of the economic liberalization process, which involves decontrol of prices. And so if somebody could charge only 100 rupees per kilogram of some item under public ownership, they can now charge 150 rupees. And that extra 50 rupees shows up as improvement in profit, which is really nothing to do, again, with the managerial factor or the change in ownership per se. So my point is that privatization results in improvement in ownership because of factors that are extraneous to ownership. But these studies which are carried out in privatization don't try to pin down the factors responsible. And they say after privatization, performance is improved without seeing that the factors that are responsible are some of the factors that I have maintained. Very often, just to give you one other factor, state-owned enterprises sit on large tracts of land. The private owner comes in, disposes of the land, shows a huge increase in income and profit. And people say, oh, privatization has produced a miracle. So these nuances are very often lost sight of. And people don't try to, even in many privatization studies, they don't try to examine what exactly are the factors that have resulted in improvement post-privatization.
Very insightful. How do you respond to the common critique that public sector firms are inherently inefficient due to bureaucratic control and lack of market discipline?
Yeah, so it's a fact that, they are subject to bureaucratic controls, including price controls of the sort that I mentioned. But you see, in most cases, in many cases, privatization has happened in contexts where there were no active capital markets. So there was a straight leap from 100% government ownership to 100% or substantial private ownership. But here in India, we have adopted something which is very different, which is called disinvestment or partial privatization, where the government sells shares to institutional owners and to the public at large, retail ownership and institutional ownership happens without the government losing control. So if the government is having 100% ownership, it brings it down to 80%, 75%, 65% by bringing in institutional and retail owners. And the share of the public enterprise comes to be listed on the stock exchange. And so the moment the share price starts moving up and down, that itself subjects the enterprise to a lot of market discipline. Because if the government takes decisions which impacts the share price adversely, immediately there's a strong reaction from institutional investors and from retail investors who are also part of the electorate. So you see, the government cannot take decisions which undermine the profit or profitability of the firm, and automatically a certain degree of market discipline is imposed on these enterprises. And what I have found in my study is that disinvestment itself has contributed to improvement in performance without change in ownership. And by the way, there are also studies in other parts of the world which have shown that partial privatization does result in improvement in performance. But as I mentioned, in India, as in other parts of the world, privatization is part of the larger economic liberalization process, which involves removal or relaxation of price controls, greater export orientation, etc. And in India, state-owned enterprises have benefited from these relaxations consequent to disinvestment, and they have shown an improvement in performance. So the presumption that enterprises cannot be subjected to market discipline because they're under government ownership is simply not true. All you have to do is to bring in owners other than government and list this share in the stock exchange. And the moment you do that, market discipline happens.
In your analysis, you mentioned that revenue rising has often been a stronger motivation for privatization than efficiency. Could you unpack this? How has this priority shaped India's privatization strategy?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, the governments are typically subject to fiscal constraints. They're not able to earn enough revenues from taxes and other non-tax sources. And they say, well, how do I fund my budget? Let me sell off some enterprises and raise revenues. And so revenue raising is certainly one of the important objectives of privatization. And although the governments may claim that the motivation is to improve efficiency, the more pressing reason very often is simply trying to raise revenues. Now, what happens is that if you're just if you're desperate simply to raise revenues, then there's a temptation to sell off enterprises at prices which don't reflect the fair value. Let's say the fair value of an enterprise is 100 rupees per share, and you're just in a hurry to raise revenue. There's a temptation to sell it at 70 rupees and bring in whatever revenues are possible. Now, if you do that, then the private owner who has bought the enterprise which is worth 100 rupees at 70 rupees has no particular motivation to improve efficiency. He has already realized a gain of 30 rupees. And so he has no particular motivation to improve efficiency. And therefore, the objective of improving efficiency is undermined in the quest for revenue raising. But here in India, fortunately, we have a system of checks and balances on government which are more rigorous than what you would have found in Latin America or Eastern Europe or Russia and other places where privatization happened. And so, the Controller and Auditor General does a very rigorous audit to find out whether the enterprise was sold at a fair price, whether enough bidders were available so that the auction price was reasonably efficient. And therefore, it has not been easy for successive governments, to simply dispose of enterprises at whatever price is offered by the private owner. And for the same reason, 100% transfer in ownership has not happened. And as I said, what we have done is partial privatization or disinvestment, where the government sells shares in tranches, 10% first, another 10%, 5%, etc. And because of this rigorous system of checks and balances, in a typical year, it is not possible to effect more than a certain amount of sales. So over the last several years, recent years, the average realization has hovered in the range of 40 to 50,000 crores, with exceptions in 1 or 2 years. And so here in India, the democratic process which we have, since we are a vibrant democracy, the democratic process has ensured that revenue raising is not the primary objective. And improvement in efficiency is also a key driver of privatization. So this is one of many respects in which Indian privatization has been refreshingly different from what has happened in other parts of the world.
India's public sector has historically played a crucial role in industrialization and infrastructure. Do you see a continued role for public enterprise in strategic sectors?
Well, what has happened is various governments at various points in time have declared that they want to restrict public enterprises only to a few strategic sectors, because the argument is that government is not in the business of business, and therefore it should restrict the number of enterprises, etc. So the current government announced in the budget for 2021-22 that state-owned enterprises or public enterprises will be restricted to four strategic sectors: atomic energy, space and defense, transport and telecommunications, power, petroleum and other minerals, banking, insurance, etc. Four sectors. But this government has simply not got around to implementing it. On the contrary, in the last budget, which was not the last one, the budget for 2024-25, the government came out at that time, the government came out and said that target-driven privatization is off the agenda. And it went so far as to show disinvestment proceeds as part of miscellaneous receipts. The very heading, disinvestment and privatization, was taken off the budget papers. And you see, this is because, this government has realized, as earlier governments did, that we don't have a political consensus in favor of wholesale privatization of well-performing and profitable state-owned enterprises. So the public at large is not willing to accept the privatization of enterprises that are performing well. If you have a loss-making enterprise, say Air India, with huge accumulated losses, then the public is willing to live with transfer of ownership to private hands. Otherwise, there is still, I would say, a strong emotional attachment to the idea of public enterprise. And therefore, the removal of public enterprises from business in general has not happened on any meaningful scale. Now, there's another factor which has come to the fore in recent years, which I want to flag. And this is that state-owned enterprises have reservations for disadvantaged groups, but there are no reservations in the private sector. And so the disadvantaged groups, which are electorally very significant, have opposed privatization, saying that this is an attempt to take away jobs which are reserved for them. And therefore, it's very difficult for this government or any other government to embark on privatization on any significant scale. So I would say that privatization in the sense of wholesale transfer of ownership is significantly off the agenda at the moment.
Professor, privatization has been justified in part by citing global best practices. How does India's experience compare to other emerging economies, say in Latin America or Eastern Europe?
Yes, so the difference is one that I've already indicated, which is that in many of those places, there were no active capital markets. So state-owned enterprises were sold off left, right, and center. But here in India, as I pointed out, that has not happened. And what we have seen is limited kind of disinvestment and subjecting state-owned enterprises to market discipline through the capital markets. So that makes the Indian experiment in privatization quite unique. There's another facet of Indian privatization, which I want to highlight because that's also unique. In banking, there has been no privatization at all of public enterprises in the sense of change of ownership. What has happened is strictly disinvestment. In the case of industrial or manufacturing enterprises, some enterprises have changed ownership and the private owners have assumed control. But there is nothing of that kind which has happened in the field of banking. What we have done is to open up the banking space to new private firms to come in. So what we mean by privatization is that the share of private banks grows significantly without public sector banks changing ownership. So that is the particular kind of privatization that we have adopted. So let new enterprises come in, but we are not going to sell public sector banks. And as a result of that, what has happened is the share of foreign banks in Indian banking has actually gone down consequent to economic liberalization, which is a very striking phenomenon because what you see in Latin America and other places consequent to economic liberalization is that the share of foreign banks in the banking sector has gone up dramatically. So this again is another respect in which Indian privatization differs significantly from other privatization experiments.
You emphasize that public sector firms operate under different constraints than private ones. Can you elaborate on how governance, objectives, and accountability differs across the two?
Yeah, so the objectives of public and private enterprises certainly differ. I mean, it's not that state-owned enterprises are not asked to make profit now. There is an enhanced focus on profit and profitability, but there are also social objectives that they have to keep in mind. Many of the state-owned enterprises have large townships where they provide housing, hospital, and other facilities of the sort that would not be very common in the private sector. Then I also mentioned that there are reservations in state-owned enterprises which don't apply to the private sector. Public sector banks have to be part of larger social initiatives such as financial inclusion to a greater extent than private enterprises. So some of your listeners may be aware of the Jan Dhan Yojana scheme, where large numbers of small account holders were brought into the system. And most of the responsibility of that, overwhelming chunk of responsibility rested on public sector banks. And so there are different objectives. At the same time, one must not presume that governance in the private sector is necessarily superior to that in the public sector. See, there is one respect in which private ownership in India differs from private ownership in, say, Western countries. Here, the dominant form of ownership, the form of ownership that is most common, is that there is a dominant owner. So you have large industrial groups which have majority or dominant shareholding. So the Anglo-Saxon model, where you have professional managers managing private enterprises subject to institutional and retail ownership, professional managers which are subject to discipline by financial institution ownership, that is not the model that we have. You have private industrial groups which have 30, 40, 50, 60% ownership. And so if you look at the model that is operating in government and in the private sector, the model is basically the same. In public sector, you have government as the dominant owner. And in the private sector, you have one private party as the dominant owner. And therefore, the conflict of interest with what is called the agency problem, which is the conflict of interest between the dominant owner and other owners, that is there in the public sector, that is also there in the private sector. The key difference between the public and private sectors, I would say, is that monetary incentives are significantly greater in the private sector. So, for instance, stock options are given to managers and they have greater incentive to perform. Now, if this is not there in India, public sector enterprises, you don't have stock options, or certainly not to the same extent. But there is no reason why that should not happen. So China has experimented, for instance, with giving stock options to managers. Yes, so that is the difference. But there is also the larger question whether monetary incentives themselves translate into superior performance. So, so I would say that it's very difficult to argue that governance is necessarily superior in the private sector, because, as I said, the basic ownership model is the same. There is a dominant owner in both.
Professor, my last question. If you had to suggest a more balanced reform agenda, one that isn't driven by privatization dogma, what would it look like for India today?
Well, it's not a question of what I would like to prescribe, but rather what the political reality in India dictates. And as I mentioned, over 3 decades of liberalization, we have reached a consensus on a number of economic issues, including privatization. So the Congress-led UPA government was not in favor of wholesale transfer of ownership, and it was in favor of partial privatization or disinvestment. The NDA government, in its earlier avatar and also in its current avatar, initially came out in favor of strategic sale or wholesale transfer of ownership, but it has veered around significantly to the idea of partial privatization. As I emphasized, privatization in banking hasn't happened at all in the sense of any change in ownership of public sector banks. So we have a certain reality out there which is dictated by the democratic process. And I think it would be presumptuous on my part or on the part of another academic to prescribe something which is contrary to the democratic reality. But that said, I would say that there is plenty of scope for governance reform in state-owned enterprises. A lot of improvement in governance has happened, but it's an evolving process. And I think as long as we have public sector enterprises in industrial sector and also in banking, it is incumbent on the government to focus on governance reform. For instance, I think the composition of boards of directors, the quality of people that you bring in, the compensation that is paid to boards of directors in the public sector vis-a-vis the amounts that are being in the private sector. These are some of the issues that need to be looked into. They are being looked into. Some improvements have happened, but as I said, there's plenty of scope for governance reform.
Thank you, Professor T.T. Ram Mohan, for that deeply engaging and thought-provoking conversation. Your insights on privatization, public sector efficiency, and the broader implications of economic policy have been both enlightening and timely. It's been a privilege to explore the themes of your book, Privatization in India, Challenging Economic Orthodoxy, and to better understand the nuances of a debate that is often presented in binary terms. Your clarity of thought and depth of experience have added immense value to this discussion. Thank you once again, Professor T.T. Ram Mohan. It's been an honor to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Deepak, again for inviting me on this show. I must congratulate you on this initiative of yours, which attempts to bring the works of academics to a larger audience insofar as the issues relate to matters of public policy. And I sincerely hope that this little conversation that we have had will add some value to listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you.